Mark Alan Hewitt, welcome to the Neuroarchitect.
Thank you for having me. I also, at Penn, got interested in the work of James Gibson through a professor, John Lang, who taught a course on designing for human behavior. So that's always been an interest of mine. And in fact, I then wrote a thesis at Penn, I think the first thesis to do this, using James Gibson's ideas about affordances and occlusion in talking about architectural ornament. My interests continued in architectural history, but I also got more and more interested in behavioral aspects of architecture, also on the what I called embodied cognition for design.
In simple words for the audience, what's design cognition?
Well, design cognition is how architects or anyone who creates an artifact thinks about how to do that. And so instead of just looking at it from an architectural point of view as how someone draws, I try to look at things from a broader perspective in terms of what I call modes of conception. Humans need to, apply their imagination to do that. But they also need, because a building is very complicated, they have to have steps. Sometimes there's a sort of heuristic or rules of thumb. How are they going to go about that building of the object rather than representing the object prior to doing the building?
You were also talking about ornaments. What about this research? What did you find?
Well, I have a thing called the teleology of architectural ornament. What is ornament for, and how do we use the human sciences to tell us why ornament is necessary in buildings? And the reason it's necessary, in a few words, has to do with our vision and the things and what James Gibson called occlusion. What is in front of something else? If it's a freestanding element, perhaps ornament is on an obelisk, or ornament is on something that is trying to get your attention. And so attention is very important in terms of how we negotiate the environment, how we do wayfinding. And it's if one looks historically at ornament, it's almost always, if it's not decoration, which is surface, it's almost always at the edge of an architectural surface. And it's prior to 1920, every architecture, Chinese architecture, Mayan architecture, Indian architecture, classical architecture, all architecture uses architectural ornament. It's only after the modern movement that we stopped doing that.
Because you focused also on classical architecture. If you want to compare the classical architecture with today's architecture, if you want to take a specific environment, you want to compare the old with the new. What do you see? How does it impact humans?
Well, I also have a paper that I wrote for a conference on health and classical architecture at Cambridge a few years ago, is how do classical buildings, and in this case, Greek archaic and classical, the two terms are actually quite precise. That would be from the 7th down to the 4th century. In ancient Greece, you have these two kinds of temples. And it turns out that the Greeks understood emotion in terms of breathing, in terms of, shortness of breath, and they knew about PTSD. And they actually, in their columns and in their temples, were telegraphing very specific aspects of the emotion of battle, the emotion of sacrifice in these temples. And of course, columns are all about the human figure. In a column, you have the head, which is the capital. You have the base, which is the foot. You have various allusions to things like animal bones. And so classical ornament, and indeed the whole classical language of architecture, was very precisely indexed to states of emotion and the body. And this hasn't been pointed out much in the previous literature.
I've been doing research about the old civilizations, the ancient civilizations, let's say, and if their spaces were made in a way to alleviate symptoms of PTSD or, mental conditions. And here you're saying that you found that they reflected the emotions. But do you see also that they might have been done in a way to alleviate these mental conditions, such as PTSD?
Well, I would say yes. I mean, for one thing, of course, when you talk about biophilic ornament and things that help buildings that help us understand nature and our relationship to the natural world. Classical buildings, and that includes any classical buildings, but particularly Greek classical buildings, are always pointing us in the direction of a proper relationship between ourselves and nature, in a way that helps us understand why nature is so soothing, why nature makes us feel so much more human. Of course, we're animals, and it helps us relate to our animal nature. The Greeks, of course, were constantly at war. Ancient Greeks, war happened every 40 years, basically, right? So it was a fact of their lives, and if they're going up to the Temenos, they're in a polis, and their polis has fought a war against another polis. If they walk up into the Temenos and they feel that battle was justified, that in fact those that died, maybe their sons, died not in vain, but for the purpose of defending the polis, that in fact helps them understand how those emotions are in their bodies, right? I mean, that's only natural. So I'd say keep up your research on these ancient sites, because there's all sorts of great things one can learn about emotion, especially about the emotional nature of architecture and landscape, if one researches those. And that includes things like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. I know you had done some work in Turkey. Ephesus, any of the Turkish sites, Aphrodisias, all of those sites contain so much that we can learn about architecture.
Since you mentioned that you didn't visit the site, but you're talking about it, have you ever visited an ancient site, like you engaged all your senses in it? And if you did, like, what were your feelings? What did you find?
Well, at Paestum in Italy, I spent a lot of time in Italy. And one of the most important experiences, architect experiences in my entire life, I would say, was approaching the temples at Paestum, the three large temples that are among the best preserved Greek temples in the world. As you may know, both Sicily and Italy have fantastically well preserved sites. And I remember at first, from far away, this is in the early 1980s, so there weren't a lot of tourists there at that point. I remember that my body, well, first of all, I became very, not agitated, but emotional as I walked toward these columns. Of course, the Greeks thought of them as bodies, or the hoplites, of course, hoplites is essentially the word for soldier in Greek. So marching up to those and feeling that there were kind of these soldiers standing in front of me was one of the most powerful and awe-inspiring emotions I have ever experienced in my life.
Yes, it's true. I've worked on this as a researcher, but also I've taught history of architecture. And what I can see is that, since humans always wanted to, and until now, we want to keep our imprint, and this is through what we can see the most, which is architecture and the built environment. So the Romans were more about showing their power, and the Greeks were more like showing power, but also knowledge, the power of knowledge. It's not only the power of war. Because when you look at the columns, when you look at the temples, there's this femininity, there is this, they're trying to show the wisdom of art, of the handwork, more than just like the war mentality, the war work.
Well, yes, I also, one of the parts of my research that I'm quite involved in today, because I also work on the restoration of buildings, especially classical buildings here in the U.S., and I write about classical architecture in the U.S. It's another way in which I think neuroscience helps us to understand those ancient civilizations and how closely they allied themselves with art, let's say.
One of the interesting things that I've seen throughout my experience is when I met different communities and different people, from different backgrounds. And I saw that they measure time in a different way. So, for example, what is for Greeks like quite new is for Americans like kind of old. because they told me we are a new civilization, so we cannot really measure what you were talking about. I was talking about definitions, and I want to understand what's for the Americans classical, what is to be preserved in the US, for example.
Well, we're a young country. And I just also did an essay about Thomas Jefferson and ancient Greece. He read Greek, by the way, and he thought of America as a new Greece, as as the Germans did for a little while when they were building their nation state, but particularly in America as a very young country. So our sense of time is, yes, rather immature. We don't see the world. Unfortunately, we see the world as future-oriented people, and that's, I think, a problem with our technocracy. Whereas I think in Europe, and I was just there for about a month, there's more of a sense of we are in a longer continuum in Europe. Just as you might say a Mayan, a native Mayan in Mexico would see herself as going back maybe thousands of years, whereas a Hispanic Mexican wouldn't necessarily have that same feeling.
What kind of buildings do you aim to preserve in the US? Like, let's say I want to visit. I've visited, but let's say I want to visit now, and you want to show me something that you are keeping. Like to say, this is part of our identity as architecture. What should I say?
Well, we would say both ancient America, and of course that would be Mayan temples as American buildings. They're not North American, but in North America we have the old pueblos, or the ancient sites in the Southwest, are very important for someone to look at, because it shows that in fact people were living here. Now those are, most of the Native American buildings like teepees and so on were ephemeral.
How do you measure beauty?
Well, I just gave a lecture in Italy about this. I called it the four pillars of beauty in architecture and landscape. And the four things that I think are most essential in terms of understanding beauty are, first, so those are the four pillars of beauty.
This is also what I saw with my students when I was teaching technical graphics, by hand. And they learned the sense of dimension through drawing by hand, the doors, the facades, to do the scales. They were able to see it, like not only to see it like behind the screen, to manipulate, let's say. They were doing it with their own hands, and it changed their perspective. And this is very important in terms of, let's say, we're talking about the neuroarchitect using neuroscience and architecture, also for the architect, not only for the user, to use their senses in doing a space, to be on site, to check the site, and the surroundings, and then to do some drawings by hand before doing the project. It's also as important.
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's another reason in my book, Draw in Order to Say, I say that students need, first of all, to travel to a project site.
Mark, thank you so much for this interesting conversation.
You are very welcome.
And thanks for watching us.